This lounge is for premium guests only." The words cut quick, no room for doubt. Sarah Miller's gaze swept over the man-wrinkled shirt-scuffed shoes, a faded backpack slung low on his shoulder. To her, he was invisible. Behind him, the doors opened. A younger man in a sharp blazer stepped inside. "Welcome back, Mr. Cole." Sarah's voice softened, a smile flickering. "Your whiskey is waiting." The sound of easy laughter drifted through as the doors closed again. The one left behind said nothing. He stood under harsh fluorescent light, still as stone, the crowd streaming past without notice. Slowly, he drew out a leather notebook, corners worn, and pressed pen to paper. Access denied. Appearance judged. He closed it, eyes steady. Who exactly was this man, and why did he write with such calm precision after being humiliated? Chicago O'Hare, 19 years old. The board above him flickered, red canceled. He had no credit card, no voucher, no one to call. Just $20 in his wallet and a backpack with 2 shirts. He asked a gate agent what to do. The woman didn't look up from her screen. "You'll figure it out." That was it. No help, no options. The terminal swallowed him. Lights, 2 bright speakers barking announcements until his ears rang. He tried to curl into a row of plastic chairs, their edges biting into his ribs. Around him, families boarded other flights, their tickets waved like keys to another world. He lay awake, his stomach hollow, his pride thinner still. And in that sleepless night he made a silent vow if he ever built an airline, no passenger would be treated as disposable. He would remember this night, the hunger, the humiliation. A single promise carried through decades, never again. Now, Dallas-Fort Worth headquarters, 30 floors above the tarmac. Harlan West sat behind a polished desk. Below, American Airlines aircraft rolled down the runways in an endless sequence, silver tails gleaming under Texas sun. From here, the company looked untouchable steel order precision. But his desk told a different story. Reports spread like an autopsy, satisfaction, falling loyalty, eroding. Not complaints about weather or luggage, deeper wounds. Page after page, words circled in red, cold staff unfriendly, treated like we don't matter. The office smelled of leather, the air conditioning steady, the silence heavy. Awards lined the wall, framed victories from another era. He leaned back, pen tapping against his knuckle. On paper, American Airlines was strong. Inside, something was rotting. The higher he sat, the clearer it became. Altitude had blinded them. The door opened without ceremony. Linda Brooks, chief operating officer, set a coffee beside him and slid another folder across the desk. Her silver hair caught the light. Her voice was flat. "They're not angry about delays. They're angry about how they're treated." Harlan scanned the pages, jaw tightening. Lines of data sharpened into faces, customers dismissed, ignored, reduced to revenue codes. He tapped his pen once, twice, but said nothing. Linda leaned forward, unblinking. "If you're thinking about going undercover again, it's reckless. Risky." His eyes rose to hers. "If I don't, we'll lose more than money. We'll lose the soul of this company." The words settled between them like a blade. For the first time in years, the decision was no longer abstract. The vow from O'Hare had returned, demanding payment. Linda's voice carried a memory neither of them had forgotten. 15 years ago in Miami, you pushed a mop at midnight. You almost got caught then. This time you're on magazine covers. Everyone knows your face." Harlan rose from his chair and crossed to the wall of photographs. Rows of frames, trade awards, gala appearances, speeches at industry summits. His finger stopped on the last picture, the glass faintly dusty, the date a year old. He looked back at her, eyes steady. "Most of our new hires wouldn't recognize me. To them, I'm a signature on their orientation video. That's the advantage." Silence expanded in the room. Linda studied him, shoulders squared, but her gaze softened with warning. She could see he was already gone, chasing a decision carved years ago. He stood in his own office, powerful yet half-vanished, daring the company he had built to forget him. The drawer slid open with a quiet scrape. Harlan withdrew a personal credit card, plain and worn at the edges. He opened his laptop, typed deliberately, and purchased an economy ticket under the name Ethan Cole. No corporate perks, no special channels, just another passenger. In his closet suits hung in ordered rows. He pushed them aside, reaching instead for shirts that lacked polish, off-the-rack cotton seams slightly frayed. A pair of shoes, scuffed to dullness, glasses with thick frames that dimmed the sharpness of his gaze. Piece by piece, the man who once stood in boardrooms dissolved. He faced the mirror. The reflection wasn't a Fortune 500 executive. It was a retired teacher on a modest trip, unremarkable, forgettable. His mouth curved not in humor, but resolve. Game on. A promise to himself, and a challenge to everyone who would soon look straight through him. The morning air carried no privilege. A yellow cab, not a company car, dropped him at Dallas-Fort Worth. The terminal stretched wide alive with movement indifferent to titles or balance sheets. He hauled his own bag through automatic doors, head lowered among strangers. At the self-service kiosk, he waited behind a family juggling strollers behind a businessman shouting into his phone. When his turn came, the screen confirmed Ethan Cole Economy Seat Boarding Group 5. He printed the pass, the paper thin and anonymous. His shirt was creased, his collar bent. No one turned their head. No greetings, no recognition. For the first time in decades, he was invisible inside the airline he had built. Through the glass aircraft gleamed under the sun, silver tails lined like soldiers. He watched them rise into the sky one after another and felt the weight of the step he had taken. The journey had begun, but he had no idea how far it would push him. The line at check-in wound like a slow river, passengers dragging bags, tempers thinning. When Harlan reached the counter, Kevin Holt glanced up, brows pinched. Put it on the scale. The suitcase settled numbers glowing within the limit. Still, Kevin shook his head, pointing at the metal frame. Rules are rules. Measure it again. Harlan slid the bag into the rack. It fit without effort. Kevin studied him, then studied the scuffed backpack on his shoulder, lips pursed as if proof still lingered. Behind them, the line grew restless. Then a man in a tailored suit stepped forward, his roller bag clearly larger. Kevin's expression shifted, the frown replaced by a brisk nod. You're fine, sir. Right this way. Harlan's mouth didn't move. He reached into his jacket, drew the leather notebook, and wrote a single line in neat script, not rules. Appearances. The ink felt heavier than the bag. The boarding call echoed across the gate. Groups shuffled toward the jet bridge, passports in hand. Harlan held out his pass, waiting for the beep. The agent scanned, then paused. One more moment, Sir ID again. He slid his license across. The agent compared, nodded, hesitated, then waved him aside. Passengers pushed past, impatient. A man in a dark blazer stepped up behind him. Welcome aboard, Mr. Turner, the agent said, voice warm, the scanner light flashing green without delay. Harlan stood still, ticket tight between his fingers. The ritual was familiar suspicion without cause, delay without explanation. His notebook opened. Diamond member, still delayed. As he wrote, the memory returned O'Hare, 19, stranded, invisible. The years collapsed into one sharp image, different airport, same judgment. He tucked the pen away, but the taste of humiliation lingered bitter as old smoke. The Dallas-Chicago flight hummed with cramped energy. Harlan slid into seat 22B, pressed between a college student asleep against the window and a businessman already spreading papers across the tray. The aisle bustled with stowing bags, clipped voices overhead, bins slamming shut. Midway through the flight, he pressed the call button. Diane Carter appeared, polished smile faint, her eyes already moving past him. Water, please, he asked quietly. She nodded once and vanished. Minutes later, she returned not with water for him, but with a glass of red wine for the man across the aisle, a Rolex catching the cabin light. Another for you, sir. Her tone softened, brightened. Harlan let out the thinnest laugh, though no one heard it. He pulled the notebook from his pocket, ink cutting across the page. Service follows the watch. The words sat stark on the paper, colder than the untouched call light above his head. The carousel groaned to life in Chicago, bags thumping onto the belt, passengers pressing forward. Harlan waited with the rest shoulders, square eyes scanning. A frail woman stepped ahead of him, hands trembling as she reached for a heavy suitcase. She strained the bag, jerking halfway before slipping back down. The employee nearby leaned against a post, unmoved, his gaze sliding past her. Moments later, a young man in a tailored suit approached. Before he could touch his case, the same employee sprang forward, lifting it with ease, setting it gently at the man's feet. Here you are, sir. The smile was instant, effortless. The woman had already disappeared into the crowd, dragging her bag unevenly across the tiles. No one noticed. Harlan did. He opened the notebook, wrote in neat strokes, strength judged by fabric, not by need. The ink sank deep into the page, his chest tightening with anger that tasted of pity. Hours stretched at the gate for Denver. Harlan sat among the weary. His boarding pass folded in his pocket, the terminal buzzing with voices that blurred into static. A young employee walked past him, eyes cool, indifferent. No greeting, not even a glance. Then the same employee spotted another traveler, a man polished to perfection, shoes like mirrors, jacket crisp. The shift was immediate. Shoulders straightened tone, warmed a polite nod that lingered a beat too long. Respect conjured from leather and shine. Harlan watched unmoving, every detail burning into memory. His pen scratched against paper. Smile is selective. The phrase hung sharp, heavier than it looked. He closed the notebook, gaze narrowing. It wasn't cruelty, not even hostility. It was worse habit, an instinct too natural to be random. His silence grew darker, as if waiting for the next crack to widen. The flight to Denver was packed bodies pressed into narrow rows. Harlan took his seat beside a dozing student, the scent of cheap cologne clinging to the air. On his other side, a businessman arranged his jacket with calculated care. Then Diane Carter appeared again. Her expression flickered as her eyes brushed over Harlan. No hostility, just a faint crease of annoyance, a shadow she didn't bother to hide. Her attention shifted quickly, landing on a man in a Ralph Lauren shirt across the aisle. Her whole demeanor changed. Shoulders, relaxed, smile, bright voice warmer than cabin lights. Harlan's lips barely moved, but his pen did. The page filled with 4 clipped words. Recognition follows brand. The line bled across the paper, clean and brutal. He leaned back, watching her laughter rise and fade. This was no accident, no isolated quirk of personality. It was a pattern repeating sharper each time, as if the uniform itself had been trained to recognize only certain kinds of passengers. The aisle narrowed, with passengers lifting bags, arms stretching awkwardly. An elderly man near the back wrestled with his suitcase, hands shaking, the weight tipping against him. Harlan reached to steady it, voice low. "Could you help?" Diane Carter walked past her stride, brisk eyes fixed forward. She didn't slow. The old man strained the case, slipping dangerously close to the floor. 2 rows behind, a younger traveler stood with little effort, his polished sneakers catching the light. Diane turned, then smiling, leaning forward, her hands quick to assist. The bag was lifted smoothly, her voice warm with casual cheer. The old man sank back into his seat, defeated. Harlan pressed his pen to the page, words cutting deep. Assistance given to appearance, not age. His pulse thundered. Heat climbed into his temples. The injustice wasn't subtle anymore. It was bold, practiced without shame. That night in Denver, the hotel room was quiet except for the shuffle of paper. Harlan spread his notebook across the desk, page after page, inked with fragments denied, ignored, delayed. Each line clinical, stripped of emotion, yet together forming a picture heavy with shadow. He read them as though they weren't his own words, but evidence from a trial, each entry another indictment. A woman lifting her bag alone. A man dismissed at the gate. Smiles rationed by fabric and polish. The desk lamp burned low, his eyes bloodshot in its glow. He stared at the pattern laid bare. This wasn't human error. It wasn't a handful of bad days. It was a current running beneath the surface, steady, unseen, corrosive. He whispered the verdict to himself, quiet but absolute. It's not mistakes. It's culture. The phrase sank into him like iron, heavy, unyielding. Morning at gate C-14. The terminal hummed with movement, coffee cups in hand, boarding passes clutched. Harlan sat apart, his notebook resting, closed his eyes, sharper than the glass behind him. An older man approached the counter, diamond status gleaming on his phone screen. The agent barely looked up. "We'll call boarding by group," he said, flatly waving the man aside. The traveler's shoulders slumped, his loyalty reduced to a line of text. 10 minutes later, a woman stepped forward, designer bag draped effortlessly over her arm. The same agent leaned in, smile-widening fingers tapping her upgrade without request. "You've been cleared for first." Gratitude spilled easily between them. Harlan's chest tightened, breath caught in anger. He opened the notebook, his hand steady despite the fire in him. Same status. Different energy. The ink dried fast, but the fury didn't. For the first time, the evidence wasn't just in his book. It was alive, playing out in front of him, impossible to ignore. The seat beside him filled with a man in his late 50s, shoulders weathered by years on the road. He set down a canvas bag and offered his hand. "David Johnson," he said, tone casual, as though introductions at gates had become ritual. Then, quieter. "They've done the same thing to me. Dozens of times." From the bag he pulled a folded sheet, flight numbers printed in neat rows, margins crowded with notes. Dates, delays, discrepancies. proof not just of memory but of pattern. He tapped a line with his finger. I used to be proud of my status. Platinum diamond, it meant something. Now it's worthless unless I'm in a suit. Harlan felt his pulse quicken, the notebook in his coat pocket suddenly heavier. This wasn't just his truth, it was another man's lived and documented. The evidence was multiplying, the silence cracking. As the gate filled with chatter, David continued, voice even almost resigned. I spent 20 years as VP of sales. Traveled weekly. Back then I wore a suit everywhere, never waited, never questioned. Upgrades were automatic. Staff knew my name. He paused, eyes narrowing. Now I consult. I dress how I want. Comfortable. That's when everything changed. He flipped the page showing scribbled remarks. Re-verify. Secondary check. Upgrade denied. Each word a bruise recorded in ink. I filed complaints, he said, almost laughing. Got the same response every time we value your feedback. Nothing changed. Harlan listened without interrupting, the words burrowing deep. He drew out his own pen and wrote quietly, patterns confirmed by others. The page trembled slightly under his hand. The weight of a culture was no longer theory. It was corroborated, undeniable. The loudspeaker called for first-class boarding. David Rowe's boarding pass in hand, platinum status glowing across his screen. At the gate, the agent frowned, scanning twice. 1 moment, sir. Passengers filed past. Behind him, a man in a blazer stepped forward. The agent smiled, instantly waved him through. Welcome aboard. The line closed behind him. David stood still, then exhaled a sigh practiced by repetition. Shoulders lifted, once dropped. Without protest, he stepped aside, waiting again. Harlan watched chest-tight fury pressing at his ribs. He opened the notebook. The line appeared hard and deliberate. Even loyalty is ignored without the look. The words carried not just his anger, but David's weary surrender. 2 men, same truth bound in ink. The Atlanta-Los Angeles flight was quiet. Half the cabin sunk into their screens. Harlan slid into his window seat, a narrow view of the tarmac glinting under floodlights. He adjusted his jacket, preparing for another uneventful stretch. Then the seat beside him filled. Diane Carter. Not in uniform this time, but jeans and a hoodie with the airline's logo faint on the sleeve. She barely glanced at him, phone already glowing in her hands. Her thumbs moved quickly, the screen lighting her face. For a moment, Harlan looked away. But one name flashed bold across the screen, a contact saved plainly, Mark Davis. His chest tightened. The name rang louder than the cabin, hum sharper than the overhead chime. He forced his gaze back to the window, feigning indifference, though his pulse betrayed him. For the first time, the mask of random bias began to crack, hinting at someone higher pulling threads. Diane's fingers flew across the glass. Some guy flagged at ATL Lounge. Same protocol at LAX. The words glowed, then vanished. Seconds later, the reply appeared. Good. Watch for similar. No hesitation, no ambiguity, just procedure. Diane tapped a thumbs up, locked her phone, and slipped it into her bag. She leaned back, eyes closed, as though nothing had happened. Beside her, Harlan stayed perfectly still, his breathing, even his posture, unbroken. Only his heartbeat betrayed him, a steady hammer in his chest. He shifted slightly, pulling the notebook onto his knee under the cover of the armrest. The line formed with deliberate clarity, flagged. Systemic. The ink cut deeper than before. This wasn't unconscious bias or careless manners. It was a script. Coordinated, executed, repeated. His fury sharpened into something colder purpose. The hotel in Los Angeles was faceless, a room like hundreds before it. Harlan sat at the desk, the surface buried under papers. His notebook lay open, pages filled with inked fragments. Beside it, a stack of documents Linda had quietly funneled to him, internal printouts, back-end logs. He traced the words on the page: override, re-verify, delay. Each entry matched what he had seen in airports across the country. Patterns weren't just lived, they were encoded. His eyes locked on a phrase that repeated across memos: brand-aligned passengers. The words chilled him. Not customers, not loyalty members. Brand-aligned. A standard written in appearance, not in value. His hand clenched around the pen until his knuckles whitened the ink, blotting slightly where it pressed too hard. Every note, every humiliation now stood backed by policy. What he faced wasn't misbehavior, it was design. The walls of the room felt closer, the silence heavier. His jaw set. The culture he had sworn to build had been rewritten behind his back. And now the evidence was undeniable. The printouts lay scattered across the desk, each one a breadcrumb leading to the same place. Override logs bore the same names: Sarah Miller at the lounge, Diane Carter in the cabin, Kevin Holt at the counter. Different cities, different terminals, but all tied together like strands of one rope. At the center was Mark Davis. His name surfaced again and again, a signature etched at the bottom of memos that sounded harmless but cut deep: efficiency initiatives, optics, protocols, brand alignment. A man brought in from a rival carrier after a merger, fast-tracked, trusted. Harlan stared at the name until the letters blurred. The laughter at the lounge, the hesitation at the gate, the polite indifference on the plane, all of it now traced back to this architect. His mouth twisted into something closer to a snarl than a smile. "So, it's you." The words were low, iron-heavy. His anger crystallized into purpose. No more notes, no more observing. The game had shifted from exposure to reckoning. The bathroom mirror reflected a stranger turned back into himself. The beard, rough and gray, scraped away clean. The plastic glasses, discarded lenses, dull and unnecessary. A navy suit slid into place, fabric sharp against his shoulders. Silk tie drawn tight at the collar-polished shoes gleaming beneath. Each layer erased Ethan Cole and resurrected Harlan West. The man who had been overlooked in terminals now stood in front of himself again, stripped of disguise. His eyes, once dulled by observation, now burned with clarity. He leaned forward, studying the familiar face tracing the steel that had built an empire from 2 planes and a folding table. The disguise had taught him the truth. The suit would carry the response. "Time to return," he whispered, not to the reflection, but to the war waiting on the other side of morning. Dallas headquarters shimmered under the rising sun, but inside the air felt tense. Harlan walked through the glass doors, shoes echoing across marble. Employees turned surprise, flickering into relief. Their greetings rose quickly. "Welcome back, Mr. West." But he gave only a brief nod. His gaze fixed his stride, unbroken. On the 40th floor, Linda Brooks was already waiting. A stack of files sat beneath her hand, the edges marked with tabs. She didn't smile. Her words were spare efficient. "Board meeting at 11. Legal's ready. HR has everything prepped." Harlan took the folder, his eyes scanning briefly before snapping it shut. The clock was already ticking, the hour narrowing. The weight of the past weeks pressed into his chest, but for the first time it didn't drag him down. It propelled him forward. The countdown had begun, not toward exposure, but toward judgment. At 11 sharp, the boardroom filled, 12 seats, occupied, papers aligned, voices hushed. Mark Davis leaned back, posture loose, confidence radiating in the small smirk tugging his mouth. He had no idea the room had shifted against him. The doors opened. Harlan West entered, navy suit, precise silk tie catching the light. He did not greet them. He stood at the head of the table, eyes hard as flint, and placed a leather notebook on the polished wood. The air stilled conversation, clipped in mid-breath. He looked from face to face, then settled on Davis for one long second before speaking. His voice carried no tremor, no excess. "This is not a report. This is evidence." The words dropped like stone into water ripples of silence spreading across the room. Laptops closed, hands froze. Mark blinked, once uncertain for the first time, though the smirk still lingered. The storm had begun. Harlan opened the notebook pages filled with neat script. He laid them down, one by one, dates, airports, names. He followed with printouts, override logs, flagged accounts, system memos. Then, screenshots of internal mail words, sharp as blades, brand-aligned passengers, discretionary protocols. He looked directly at the board. Passengers were judged, delayed, dismissed because of appearance, not status. "For 2 weeks, I lived it myself." He straightened, the pause deliberate. "I was not your CEO. I was your victim." The sentence rang across the table louder than any shout. Eyes widened, expressions cracked. For a moment, no one moved. Harlan closed the folder with finality. Across the table, Mark's brow glistened, his hands restless against his tie. The self-assured posture began to fray. The room felt suddenly too small for him. One board member cleared his throat, a voice faltering but defiant. "This seems anecdotal, Mr. West, individual incidents, not systemic proof." The challenge barely left his lips before Harlan cut across sharp as steel. "Then explain why I was flagged 3 times in 4 cities. Why my boarding was delayed again and again while wearing this." He pulled at his jacket sleeve, revealing the faded shirt beneath still rumpled from his undercover days. This $39 shirt was enough to strip me of recognition of loyalty of dignity. That is not anecdote. That is policy. The silence that followed was total. No cough, no shuffle of papers. Even the hum of the lights seemed to vanish. Mark Davis flushed deep red, shifting in his seat mouth, opening, then closing without words. The veneer of control was cracking. Every eye turned to him now, and the room waited for his collapse. The evidence lay in plain sight, spread across the boardroom table. Harlan's tone shifted from revelation to command. Effective, immediately override powers are suspended. Every name tied to discriminatory practices will be reviewed for termination, and we establish a permanent passenger council customers with direct authority to hold us accountable. The CFO leaned forward, lips thin. This will be expensive. Severance, retraining lawsuits. Harlan's eyes locked onto him. Not as expensive as losing trust. Not as costly as betraying the very people who built this airline with their loyalty. The words cut clean, leaving nothing to counter. The board whispered fragments of doubt colliding in hushed tones. Then the murmurs died, replaced by silence heavy as stone. Vote, Harlan said. Hands shifted, cards raised. Decisions etched themselves into the record. Futures balanced on lifted palms. The count was swift. 10 in favor. 2 abstentions. No opposition. The reforms stood. The verdict was final. Harlan rose from his seat, expression flat, the weight of authority pressing into the room. Across from him, Mark Davis lowered his head, lips quivering as though words might still save him. None came. Security. The word landed without heat, stripped of anger, spoken like fact. 2 men entered, their footsteps echoing on polished wood. Chairs creaked, eyes shifted. No one spoke. The moment wasn't dramatic. It was surgical, inevitable. Mark's shoulders sagged, his once bright confidence drained to gray. The board remained frozen, their decision staring back at them through his downfall. Mark Davis was led from the room, each step slower than the last. At the threshold he turned, once eyes desperate as if a glance could conjure mercy. None came. Behind him, Harlan flipped open another file pen, poised, his gaze never lifting. The dismissal was already forgotten, absorbed into the work of rebuilding. The door shut with a sharp click, final and unanswerable. The sound lingered heavier than his protests could have been. Mark's career, his influence, his schemes, all ended in that instant. Not with shouting, not with defiance, but with silence and the closing of a door. Harlan's hand moved across the page. The war was not against one man, but against the rot he had embodied. Mark was gone. The company remained, and its reckoning had only begun. The boardroom had emptied, the storm reduced to silence. Only Linda remained, her heels soft against the carpet as she approached. "It's done," she said quietly. "Legal's satisfied. HR already moving." Harlan stood apart, framed against the vast window, eyes fixed on the runway below. Aircraft lights blinked steadily, rising and falling into the night sky as if the world outside remained untouched by what had just taken place. He did not exhale in relief. His shoulders held steady, his jaw set. Victory here was only one battle won. Tomorrow, he murmured, his reflection faint against the glass, we begin again. Linda studied him for a long moment, then nodded, once the weight of his words sinking into her as much as the silence did. The fight was not over. It had only shifted ground. The office was stripped down to papers and shadows. Harlan turned from the window at last. Tomorrow morning. Broadcasted across the company. Every lounge, every gate, every crew room. No whispers. They'll hear it from me. Linda's answer came without hesitation. Already scheduled. He closed his eyes briefly, not from fatigue, but from the gravity pressing against his chest. When he opened them again, his resolve was unbroken. The glass reflected him back, a solitary figure, sharp lines cut against the city's glow, bearing the weight of 30,000 employees who would soon face his truth. The countdown had begun. At 9, sharp screens flickered awake across the country. Admirals' clubs, break rooms, cockpits, baggage tunnels, every corner of American Airlines filled with the same image. Harlan West sat before the lens, dark suit worn, but tie-loosened sleeves rolled back. His eyes were steady, voice low, carrying through static into thousands of waiting rooms. "Many of you know me as the founder," he began. The pause was deliberate, sharp. "But 2 weeks ago, I was not your CEO. I was just seat 22B. Everywhere conversations stilled. Crew leaned forward. Agents froze mid-keystroke. Pilots set down their pens. The silence grew wide taut as thousands braced for the story none of them had expected to hear. His gaze stayed fixed on the camera, steady as stone. I saw an old woman struggle with her bag while no one helped. I watched David Johnson, a loyal flyer, treated like he no longer mattered. And I stood outside our own lounge, told I didn't belong. He paused, letting the silence carry the weight. We failed them quietly, with smiles. The words cut sharper than accusation. They revealed betrayal hidden in plain view. For a moment he said nothing, the stillness heavier than any speech. Then his voice came back iron in its simplicity. That ends now. Across terminals and offices the sentence struck like a hammer. Agents shifted in their seats. Crew members lowered their eyes. For some, shame burned. For others, hope flickered. The silence that followed was not empty. It was the sound of a system realizing it could no longer look away. The changes are already underway, Harlan continued, voice rhythmic, deliberate. 17 employees have been dismissed. Override protocols are gone. A passenger council will oversee how we serve. His tone rose, measured like strikes of a gavel. Every vice president, every director, every leader, including me, will spend 2 days each year on the front line. If you lead, you will serve. The cadence was relentless, each line landing with finality. No flourish, no rhetoric, only commands written in stone. Screens across the network showed faces stiffening, realizing the magnitude. Years of distance between leaders and the ground had just been erased. A structure built on appearance was being torn down, and in its place a promise forged in labor, in service, in equality. Then his voice softened, drawn backward in time. When I was 19, my flight was canceled at O'Hare. No hotel, no money, just a vending machine that ate my last $3. He let the memory settle the silence between sentences carrying more than words. I slept between chairs while families around me boarded flights. I asked for help. A gate agent looked me over and said, "You'll figure it out." He closed his eyes briefly, then opened them again, steady. I promised myself then, never again. No one who walked through my doors would feel disposable. The system listening now heard more than a speech. They heard a wound that had never closed a vow carried across decades. In the stillness that followed, tens of thousands held their breath, the story binding them in quiet, unshakable truth. That afternoon, Harlan returned to the terminal not as a spectacle, not as a boss, but as a witness. From a distance, he watched a small scene unfold at the gate. An elderly couple approached hesitantly, tickets trembling in their hands. The agent smiled, first reached out and took their suitcase without waiting to be asked. He walked around the counter, lifted it easily onto the cart, and guided them forward with a warmth that was unmistakable. The couple's faces softened surprise, giving way to gratitude. No fancy luggage, no corporate sheen, just people treated with dignity. Harlan's throat tightened. His eyes glistened not with triumph, but with recognition. The change had begun. Not a revolution in policy sheets or boardrooms, but in a gesture so small it could be missed, and yet large enough to prove that tomorrow might already be here. "It begins," he whispered more to himself than anyone else. Back in his office, the skyline fading behind glass, Harlan welcomed David Johnson. No cameras, no audience, just 2 men seated across a desk marked with years of decisions. "You didn't have to speak that day," Harlan said quietly, "but you did. And it mattered." He slid 2 first-class vouchers across the table, not as payment, but as acknowledgement. More importantly, he offered something else, a seat on the new passenger council. A voice formal and permanent. David's hands rested on the papers. He nodded, once his voice firm. "Don't forget. Don't let it happen again." Harlan met his gaze without wavering. "I won't." The pact was sealed not by signature but by conviction. Harlan set his pen against the final page of the worn leather notebook. The words came steady without hesitation. "Respect isn't a feature, it's the flight." He closed the cover, laid the pen aside, and let the silence hold. Outside, night stretched wide across the horizon. Aircraft lights shimmered as one by one they rose into the dark, each carrying lives, each carrying trust. He spoke quietly, almost to himself, but meant for all who would hear. "Have you ever been judged by how you looked? Tell your story. Because kindness only matters when it is shared.